All right, Tennis Channel Inside In now welcoming onto the show. Very, very honored to have this guest on the show from the VSIN Network. He hosts the radio show A Numbers Game on Sirius Channel 204 weekdays out of Las Vegas. He also hosts Beating the Book podcast, which is his Twitter handle as well. Calling us in right now, Gill Alexander. Welcome to the show. First time guest. Excited to talk about your story, also some tennis with you.
Hey, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
This is a very big opportunity on the show to kind of get the bubble outside of, just the day-to-day tennis stuff, which we also appreciate. But I do like hearing different stories and perspectives of people that got into the sports industry. You've got, I think we're on decade number 4 now in sports, so a little weathered at this point.
It makes it sound so old. My God. Yeah, no. It's it's just one of these things where you start out, you're sort of born a sports fan, and you get to, people say living the dream, and I guess I ended up living the dream.
So it did start, if I have this right, it started your DMV, Washington, D.C. area. You just got hooked on sports. You had obviously the Washington Redskins football teams and some proud lineage of other sports as well, but you caught the bug early.
I was the kid who, I can't really explain it. When I was 6 years old, my parents, who were not from the United States, who immigrated so I'm first generation American. But at 6 years old, I was the kid who ran to the front door and grabbed the Washington Post and read the sports page word for word. And my parents sort of had to walk over me. I was so entranced. And the first time I saw a Skins game, I could think of nothing else. So I can't really even say, oh, I went after it. It was just born that way. I really was.
Yeah,
And
it's fascinating. Yeah, no, it's the part about the, having immigrant parents, because I have a similar origin story, and a lot of people I think that are just born into sports or just have the bug early, but you were literally the first to kind of discover it. So you didn't have it passed down. This was a pure organic love of the games.
Yeah, and some of my greatest memories of my father, quite frankly, who's no longer with us, were going to Skins games in DC, and him loving, developing the love for American football because of his child's love for it, and that was a way for us to connect. So a lot of Americans wax poetically, a lot of multi-generation Americans wax poetically about their love of baseball and how their father took them to games, and that was a way they bonded. And mine was sort of a reverse football thing, if you will.
Oh, it's very cool. It's a good perspective to kind of hear. But how was Dad with the fantasy football stuff? Because I hear you got in trouble in middle school. And this is, before the industry really blew up, but you were all fantasy sports and maybe the leader of some stuff going on there.
Well, it wasn't fantasy. I collected baseball cards growing up, and then there was a price guide, and that was sort of my first experience with sports connecting to money in any way and value. Not that the baseball card industry has really grown from there, I have to tell you. But yeah, I did. Boy, you know a lot. I did a football pool, just a simple NFL betting picks football pool that no one taught me how to do. No one told me to do it, but I was like, hey, it wasn't against the spread. It was just pick winners. It was $2, kids at school. I went to a private school outside of D.C., so it was like super buttoned up. You weren't supposed to gamble, let alone do your own side hustles.
Yep.
I remember my whole thing was, I won't. My thing for running the pool is I don't have to put in the $2, but I could still win it. So like I had all these like things that in my head, and then I got caught finally after years of being worried that I would get caught doing this. A teacher grabbed my shoulder. I'll never forget in the horror that my thing had finally been found out, and I'll never forget in his North Carolina accent, he said to me, "How do I get in on this?" So I sort of knew,
Yeah.
hey, maybe people like to gamble on this kind of thing.
Yeah, you just wanted some advice. Yeah, that's hilarious. And you mentioned like you go to these good schools, all the way through college. Was working in sports on the background, or were you on the forefront of your mind, rather, or were you just kind of playing it by ear and just seeing where life took you? Because I asked that question to a lot of people, and the results are mixed. Whether they had a plan, like I'm getting to work in sports, or they just figure it out as it goes.
Getting back to the immigrant parents, I had, let me be more specific. I have Jewish parents who, this will be very stereotypical, where their idea was I have one sibling, he's an older brother. One was destined to be a doctor in their minds, and one was destined to be a lawyer in their minds. And as cliche as that sounds, that's how my parents viewed things. And they meant well, and they meant well. They got their doctor. Um, Mitch, they got their doctor. They didn't get their lawyer. I just didn't have it in my heart. I applied to law schools because of the pressure of my dad specifically. I got into some good schools. I didn't go. I did the whole, I'm going to defer this for a year. And then, I think I even deferred it for a second year. I just kind of figured out at some point. It's like I knew what I wanted to do when I was 6 years old. When I was reading the Washington Post sports section, when I was imitating the voices of announcers. And, to my parents' credit, and I say this slowly, right? Because I'm not like,
Yeah.
I'm sort of giving them the benefit here. At some point, they sort of figured out, well, maybe this kid knows what he wants to do. But it
Yeah.
was not easy. Like there was a lot of years, even in adulthood, Mitch, where I was just like a lot of pressure still from up above in the family. So I ended up there. I probably should have ended up there sooner, quite frankly.
Yeah, I also think, not to kind of, date yourself age wise, but the industry hadn't really exploded, not just,
For
sports
sure.
gambling, but sports itself. So there would be naturally more trepidation to the fact that we don't know what this is and what his plans are. And, following in your brother's footsteps, that's a pretty hard act to follow, getting a doctor there. But, and looking at, yeah, yeah, it evens out in the long run, though. Looking at it kind of from the perspective of how you had to get there, and I did the research on you, and I'm just fascinated. It sounds like what you made up, what you didn't have an experience, you made up with just kind of working your way through and maybe talking your way into roles. Is that story true about the R&B station that you started out with? It wasn't always sports, you just find a way
Yeah,
to work in media.
I was in music. I did a slow jam show, which is like a format that doesn't even exist anymore. So it's like old R&B songs from the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, which by the way is still music I love. But
Hmm.
yeah, I mean, I wanted, at some point you get to an age where I realized I was like, well, am I going to be 40 years old and introducing a Waka Flocka Flame record? Or I just kind of came up with the
Yeah.
dumbest name I could think of. And I knew in my heart of hearts, right? Like even when I was doing that, I remember when I was literally having a radio shift, going from record to record, but I'm betting on the Florida Marlins to beat the New York Yankees in the 2003 World Series. And I bring that up because that was like one of my big underdog wins of an early age where I'm like, oh, I might actually be good at this.
Yeah.
And yeah, like even like so I lived in San Francisco at the time. San Francisco sports radio wouldn't give me the time of day. And it was pretty much the era of Jim Rome, where Jim Rome sort of dominated American sports talk radio. And he had a very aggressive, have a take, don't suck was his motto approach. And I've loved sports for my entire life. I view it analytically. I gravitate towards betting, and none of those things, that sort of cerebral approach,
Yeah.
despite the love of it, was nothing that was really um, valued back then. You had to be this aggressive macho guy to be on sports radio. So I couldn't I couldn't even get a meeting with anybody.
Mm.
And so that was like hugely frustrating for me till really a much later age than most people get into it.
Well, I mean, you said a lot there that's fascinating. You had this love, you had this passion for sports gambling, you were, invested in it. And the analytic approach, which is, in vogue right now, maybe gone a little too heavy in some areas, but
Yeah.
that that style wasn't a thing back then. And I think in your backstory I read that Moneyball comes out and you gravitated towards it, and it's, kind of reaffirming a lot of your, sounds like, thoughts that you had there. That sabermetrics approach, have you just always approached sports and maybe life analytically in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, I like to say, and I'm betting has the biggest impact betting has had on my life, besides, hey, I won this bet, I lost this bet, is that I tend to view the world through some of the principles of betting. And I view everything as a probability. And by the way, that makes you a little mashugana to use my my parents' word. But it was getting to your point. There was a bigger thing there where it's like it was not a valued thing back then. And yes, you're right. When Moneyball came out, the Michael Lewis book and then the subsequent movie, it was sort of like, oh, there are my people. There they are.
Mhm.
And that caused me to gravitate towards, that was the light bulb for me where it was like, oh, I love betting. I've already been betting. Now I need to apply those principles. In Moneyball, Michael Lewis talks about how Billy Beane, the Oakland A's general manager, recognized market inefficiencies in player development, player acquisition, really.
Right.
And I immediately said, oh, this is what I should be doing in betting. I should be a baseball. I should really focus on baseball and look at the inefficiencies. I grew up on baseball cards. There's stats on the back of a baseball card. But I knew, even at the age of 8, I just couldn't articulate it. I knew that those stats didn't explain baseball in the way that the mainstream media was explaining baseball. There was so much more to it. So essentially, what I ended up, sort of the light bulb of Moneyball for me was, whereas Billy Beane used it for, recognizing inefficiencies in acquiring players, the player acquisition market, Major League Baseball. For me, it was, oh, I can exploit baseball betting
Mhm.
by going past the baseball card stats of wins, losses, and ERA to sites like Fangraphs, because I was not responsible for the creation of the stats, but I was able to apply much more detailed stats of minutia in baseball that truly reflected the skill sets of pitchers
Mhm.
that weren't really incorporated into the betting lines back in the early parts of the 2000s.
It's very, forward thinking, because nowadays it seems like that's something that everyone's trying to get a leg up on, and you were
Oh,
looking
yeah.
at it at that point. Did you feel like you had to get to Las Vegas? Was that something when you had that
No,
eureka moment, or no?
no. As a matter of fact, I'd never, I resisted. I was like, I don't want to live in Las Vegas. I live in,
No.
the only places I've ever lived in my life, really, besides college, were Washington, D.C. and San Francisco. And I didn't have any real desire to live in Las Vegas. There were other means of betting, if you know what I mean, Mitch.
Yeah.
And and so I was able to, I was fine doing that. It was only until I became actually employed in sports betting media that I finally moved to Las Vegas.
It's a very, interesting, cool story that you find your lane. And then again, once you get to the sports industry and the sports betting industry, looking at your resume and the shows you host, just trying different things and finding a way to, you know, carve your own lane, carve your own path in a crowded industry that's by the day getting more crowded.
Yeah, for sure. But I always knew. Here's the thing. I remember when I started doing a podcast first, well before everybody on Earth had a podcast. In 2010, I started doing the Betting Dork podcast, which was, you know, really primitive. There was only one other sports betting podcast that I was aware of at the time, and ESPN did it. And so I developed a big listenership of, the first time I did it, I was like, wow, there's 5 people listening, but one's in Germany and one's
Yeah.
in, it was like the craziest thing, like this advent of this new technology. And so I did something pretty innovative, which was I actually told people when I lost bets also, which, in an industry
That's
where no one ever loses, my God, they won't tell you about it. So people kind of gravitated towards that, and it grew from there. And my dad, again, back to my dad, I don't want to, may rest in peace. I don't want to say anything badly, but he was like, oh, you're wasting your time, he used to say in his voice. And I was like, no, because I knew that it would become legal at some point in the U.S. I didn't know that it would in the year 2018 when it finally did. I thought probably I would have predicted a little later than that, but I knew it would happen eventually. And
yeah.
so the world's coalesced.
Yeah. And making sure that you point out losses is a huge thing. I see that with content all the time. It feels like the shows that really do have staying power and are entertaining are able to laugh at themselves and realize, okay, I whiffed on this one. You see that in the traditional sports media too. More with Gill Alexander here on Tennis Channel Inside In. Getting to, the sport that we cover here at my network, tennis. You've been on the forefront with that, some handicapping. And I always look at, tennis betting and how the industry has exploded. And I wanted to get, your perspective, because there's so many matches, there's so many strategies, there's tournaments that are huge. How do you attack tennis betting, so to speak?
Well, I first got into tennis seriously. I was a baseball bettor, as we described first, and the reason that I gravitated towards baseball is because baseball is a team sport, or is an individual sport really disguised as a team sport. Because every play starts with a pitcher throwing a baseball, pitching a baseball to a batter, and then everything happens from there. Once that sport started to change, and by that I mean starting pitchers came out of games earlier. Um, Even some managers started with what they called openers, and so they were only on the hill for one inning or two to start a game. When that started to happen, my ability to wrap my arms around baseball lessened. And I always loved tennis. I had bet tennis super casually before that, nothing serious. And I was like, okay, there's got to be something here with tennis that might not be in the betting lines either. And so, yeah, that's what really did the transition to me and for me. And I became sort of a serious bettor towards the latter part of last decade. And I had some really spectacular years betting tennis. By the way, this is not one of them. 2023 was a tough,
I
tough year.
wanted to, yeah, I
Yeah,
wanted to get to that too, because, and that's kind of the current landscape. It is cool to hear. It sounds like you were a fan before, like you
oh,
were a fan of tennis, and your era. Timing is everything, right? And your formative years were a big boom in this country, let's say.
yeah. Oh no, I mean I loved McEnroe as a kid. Um, I liked Jimmy Connors. I probably don't like what I hear about him as an adult when you sort of peel back the curtain on some personalities. But I mean, I grew up I remember distinctly where I was. This is how old I am. When Borg played Connors in that famous match at Wimbledon, one of their famous matches at Wimbledon. But so you remember moments like that. You remember when a little later when Connors beats Cricksteed at the U.S. Open. There's so many of these images emblazoned in your mind. I was just reading Agassi's biography the other
Oh,
day, and
amazing.
it's just incredible. That book I recommend it for, like, it doesn't even have to be a tennis biography. It's one of the great biographies I've ever read. He's so brutally
Absolutely.
honest in it. Um, but like there's a documentary on about Marty Fish about the mental health struggles that he's gone through. I've been to one U.S. Open match in my life. That happened to be it coincidentally. So tennis was always something through the years that I loved. But from a betting standpoint, I was like, okay, let me see if I can exploit this. And, you know, 2020, I had Iga Swiatek winning the French Open
Yeah.
based on her numbers, her raw data, which I'll get to in a minute, from some of the lower tours. Um, and she won as a 33 to 1 dog, 30 to 1 primarily in most places. Um, but then it was, but mainly what I did was match by match. And in the year 2021, I was able to really crush tennis based on, and I don't know how interesting this is to your listeners, but based on serve percentage, winning serve points, return of serve percentage in terms of both men and women, the rate at
Mhm.
which those points were won, break point data as well, because that's sort of the runners in scoring position of baseball or the third down conversions of football. Those are more variant, and you can sort of, some people overperform or underperform on that. And then the gradations of surface, right? Clay versus hard court versus grass. And within hard courts themselves,
Yeah.
different gradations of what's fast hard court, what's slow hard court. So all of that, I became a super big tennis bettor. But I will tell you, like, the edge this year is much more difficult to beat this year for me.
Right. And in terms of grading out, that's why tennis is so fascinating. We're just talking head to head matchups for futures to win tournaments. There's rankings, but as you know, it's cumulative to the year. It doesn't take into account form. Surface is different. Also, head to head, how players do in individual matchups. And as you said, those stats peel back a lot of info, how players serve, how they return, the matchups themselves. Again, props from the Iga call. I know not everyone would give you props, but I'll give you props on this show
Thank
for
you.
that call.
Well, in 2020, that was a heck of a thing. I think, by the way, just to get into that, like, I
Mhm.
think Iga's win in Beijing here this past week was her way of saying, I hope you all enjoyed it while it lasted. It's
Yeah,
about to be me again.
it's so true, because she's still, well, ho hum. This isn't her best year. She's not number one. She still won 60 matches on the season and counting. And people are going to make adjustments. Iga was the top dog. They were chasing her. They raised their level. Coco wins the U.S. Open. Sabalenka's got number one. Of course, Iga's going to bounce right back herself. So that's just another thing that I look for there. But we have a lot of still info to get to on this show, and I wanted to kind of get Gil your perspective on in this time frame, Gil, given the fact that we're coming off an era where we had top dominant players. We had the big three on the men's side. We had the Serena Williams era. we're getting there with players like Alcaraz and Iga, but maybe that does make it harder. And I'm curious to hear your take on this. If it's harder to price and make bets, knowing that the field does seem a little more wide open than it's been. Not that it's a bad thing for the quality of tennis, but how does that impact the betting strategies?
Yeah, my buddy Dan Weston, who bets tennis for big international site like Betfair and Pinnacle, we had a discussion about this the other day where it's like the margins do seem thinner this year in a way that there is a little more variance than we'd like in terms of outcomes. I mean, I just anecdotally, I've lost so many bets this year on in matches where you're like, I cannot believe I lost that. Like, right? Because
But
you
you
had,
still feel good after. You're like, I'd make that bet again.
I'd make that bet again. And that, by the way, that's the key to betting, right? Being
Yeah.
able to overcome negative variance like that. Um, it's interesting. I'll just from a macro, non-betting perspective. Iga being it's so funny. You're right. It's considered a down year. That's because she came off a year when she won 37 matches in a row and won 2 slams and was number one for 75 straight weeks. And she won 5 tournaments this week, and it's 5 this year rather. Pardon me. And it's considered a down year. I still think she's the best player, but you're right. Like those other players raise their level, and that's going to happen. I will say on the men's tour, if you look back on 2023, and I get it, we're still in October, so there's still a little more to be written about it. But if we think about where our brains were in January, I think this is a representative feeling. I think we thought that the whole Garunes of the world and the Yannick Sinners of the world and other players of that ilk would kind of close the gap a little bit. And I'm not sure we really saw that this year. I still think those things will happen, right? Yannick Sinner is clearly on
Mhm.
the cusp, but it didn't really happen this year. It was sort of like, wow, no, yeah, Novak Djokovic and Carlos Alcaraz are still a cut above. Obviously, we had great years for some guys like Tommy Paul, but they're
Yeah.
not really at that. Listen, I used to say about Djokovic, Federer, and Nadal, they're better at tennis than any of us are at anything. So pick anything you do in the world. They're gods, and Carlos Alcaraz is at that status too. So it's to answer your question. That's a long-winded way of saying it's tough. It's tough to beat now based just on the numbers that
Mhm.
I cited earlier. And if it were ever that easy, right? That's the other thing, Mitch. Like it's never as easy as, oh, here are the numbers this person's going to win, juxtaposed against
Mhm.
the value. You take a match today.
Mhm.
Lesia Tsurenko is playing Donna Vekic. I think there's value on Lesia Tsurenko as a slight underdog. This is in China, I believe,
Mhm.
and that's great. But there's some people who would say, yeah, but remember these two have history. Vekic wouldn't shake Tsurenko's hand back at Indian Wells.
The injury
Because
drama.
yeah, because
Yeah.
well, it's the injury drama. Tsurenko acted like she was going to retire after every
Mhm.
point.
Mhm.
Um, at that time, I think Tsurenko had lost matches by walkover or retirement like
Yeah, it
8
was
or
an
last 7.
insane
Yeah, it was
number.
ridiculous.
And then she
So
did pull out the next match too. I was at that Indian Wells. Yeah.
that's right. Oh, you were. I was at
Yeah.
Indian Wells too. Oh, I missed you there.
Yeah.
Um, so I don't know. Some people would say, yeah, you can throw out all those numbers. Vekic just wants to kill her. So there's always that kind of uh, less quantitative stuff that goes into all of this as well.
The consistency of the top players to be, not anyone, but a select few can have great tournaments, can have great runs, can get hot for a month. But what really separates the best of the best, obviously the big three, Alcaraz there, and now Iga too, is that week in, week out, they are going to go deep into tournaments and give themselves a chance to win. So their baseline game, and not just from the baseline, but their low level, their floor is phenomenal. Before we wrap this up, Gill Alexander, this has been a blast. I do want to, know from the personal perspective of, and I'm sure you deal with this a lot. We deal with this too here, but reacting and the negative connotations to gambling. How you deal with people that are just not, for it and think it might be doing harm in a way to the sport, to the sports that they love. How do you deal with that kind of perception and reaction?
I hope that judgment goes away about it. I think that, yeah, I mean, look, can betting have a downside? Of course it can if it's not done responsibly. Sure, there is absolutely that exists. That's always going to be a part of society. no matter what. And I think I think the industry takes a good amount of measures to really provide help for those that go down the wrong path. But as far as it diminishing the sport in any way or hurting the sport in any way, betting only helps. Betting only helps from a standpoint of bringing in fan excitement. There are people out there that would never have gravitated towards tennis who now will. Um, does tennis have a specific? Now, I will allow for this. Does tennis have a specific thing because it's an individual sport where the lesser tours could be affected by some bad actors? Yes, and we've seen that. And that is absolutely still something that's out there. It's not going to affect, majors and masters tournaments and 500s on the main tour. But yeah, on ITF and maybe on some of the 250s and 125s where people aren't making as much money, that's always going to be an issue. So I will concede that point. But in terms of more macro than that, because those are always going to be exceptions to the rule, I think the wider the net you cast, the better it is for the sport that we love. And I will say it till the day I die. There is nothing as great as tennis from both a physical and mental combination. It's the greatest sport on earth.
Might be the most well-rounded athletes in the world, given what they have to do in the mental challenges. And I'm with you there too. I mean, doing it responsibly, tennis might be more susceptible to some bad actors. I think raising the money and raising the prize money all across the board is helping because it's, taking away that carrot, so to speak, that's dangling there. Well, Gil, this has been a blast. Last thing, what do you have on tap? We know about the show. We know about a numbers game, daily during the week, and the Beating the Book podcast. Anything else on the horizon we should know about?
No, that's it. Numbers game is 10 to noon Eastern on VSIN.com, on iHeartRadio, YouTube TV, and on the DraftKings network. And then the Beating the Book podcast, which is primarily football, American football, I must tell you, during the American football season. But we do all the previews for all the slams in the off season. We have a ball with tennis.
Do you have any futures already for Australia? Are we thinking yet, or are we going to wait a little bit?
I don't have any in pocket. I would tell you if I did. There is no 30-1 shot, as you intimated. I go, it's tough at this point to get in front of the Iga train or the Carlos train. So like the days of 30-1s, they'll come back one day, but it's not right now.
Women's tennis is kind of it's in a better place than it was maybe like 2-3 years ago, because you have I'd say 8 to 12 women that I'd put at the cut, where, even then you're not going to get that super long shot. You might still, but this year we saw a lot of talented women. I think they're all still in the top 10 win majors.
Yes, and to your point, like anybody who had Marketa Vondrasova winning Wimbledon, like my hat's off to you, because I didn't see that coming. So yeah, anything's possible.
We'll have to get you back on as we gear up for the major season, getting some advice in Australia. Gill Alexander from the VSIN Network, thanks so much for coming on Tennis Channel Inside In. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Mitch. I appreciate it.